Hi, my name is Daria, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to set up a project render in DaVinci Resolve's Deliver page. I've already got a project open. This has been assembled in DaVinci Resolve's Edit page and then color graded in the Color page. So I am now ready to jump into the Deliver page by going to the very bottom of the interface and clicking on the little rocket ship that says Deliver to now access my Deliver page. The interface features just a few panels. On the left-hand side, we have our render settings. This is where you're going to be spending the majority of the time setting up your parameters. At the top, we have our viewer, which is showing you exactly what you're going to be rendering. And to the right of that, we have our render queue, which is going to contain a list of all the jobs that we're going to render. Underneath the viewer, we have two forms of the timeline. We have a thumbnail timeline, similar to the one that we saw in the Color page, which represents every clip as its own still thumbnail image. And then under that is the Edit page timeline, which shows you the exact relationship between the clips, their durations, the various video and audio tracks. At the very top of the page, we have the interface toolbar, which allows us to further customize the layout of the Deliver page. So for example, the render settings by default takes up the entire height of the page, but I can use the collapse button to the left of it to shrink the render settings and prioritize the bottom half of the screen to our timeline. But I will click this arrow to expand render settings so that I can see the full list of controls. An important thing to keep in mind before we jump into the details of the Deliver page is that it takes only 3 steps to set up a render job. Number 1 is going into the render settings and setting up your parameters as needed for your particular project. Number 2 is going into the timeline panel where you'll determine the duration of your render. So by default, the render is set to entire timeline. And then number 3 is clicking Add to Render Queue at the bottom of the render settings. This will place your job into the render queue panel in the top right corner. So just those 3 steps: render settings, timeline duration, and Add to Render Queue. Once all of your render jobs are ready, you can select Render All at the bottom of the render queue, and they will all be output to the location that you select. We'll begin with the Render Settings panel. At the very top, you can see a list of presets that comply with a series of various industry standards. On the far left, we have our custom preset. This offers us the widest set of options in terms of parameters. So it's entirely up to us to decide what video container we want to export in, what encoding language we want to use, our data rate, etc. To the right of that, we have a series of user-generated content video site presets. These presets were developed using the specifications offered on these websites, and in some cases directly in collaboration with those websites to produce the optimal settings for your videos. As you continue down the preset list, you can see that we have a series of master presets. We also have IMF video deliverables for high-end streaming services. A little drop-down arrow next to some of the presets allow you to specify with more precision where you're delivering to or what resolution you're delivering. So in this case, you can see that Disney Plus and Netflix streaming services are supported. Then, as you continue down this list, we also support round-trip workflows in case you're working with collaborators who are not using DaVinci Resolve. These type of round-trip presets tend to generate 2 types of files. One will be a set of trimmed media of all your edits on the timeline, and the other will be an XML file that they can use to reconstruct the edit on their end. So this is a pretty popular workflow if you're acting as just a colorist on the project as opposed to an all-around editor or collaborator. I'm going to navigate all the way back to the left, and we will indeed set up a job based on a preset. So I'll have YouTube set to 1080p. But I'd like to modify it a little bit. So I'd like to raise the data rate so that the quality of the video is increased. If I want to have further control over my parameters instead of just relying on the preset, I can click on the word custom next to YouTube, and that will expand my controls back to the custom selection, but it will still carry across all of the preset settings from the previous YouTube selection. So when I click on the video tab at the top, I can see that it's already set to the QuickTime format, which is what YouTube recommends, in the appropriate H.264 codec. But here I can navigate to my quality controls, which refer to my data rate, and I could decide to increase this to 12,000. So I'll click on the numeric field, type in 12, 000, and that's pretty much all I wanted to do for this job. The data rate will have the greatest impact on the visual quality of your video and also on the resulting file size. Oftentimes when you're submitting a video for a festival, so there's usually like an online submission form, it will also give you a limit on your video size. And if you do a bit of math, you can sort of reverse engineer and calculate exactly what your data rate limitation is. And that way you can increase the quality of your video while still meeting the demands of that video upload site. Or likewise, if you find that you're going just a little bit over the limit, you know that if you reduce that value, those kilobytes, then you can actually shrink the size of your video file. So that's quite helpful. I will next address the name of my video. So you can see right now it's untitled, but I can navigate to the File tab in the middle of this panel and see that rather than using a custom name, which I can go ahead and type directly into the file name field, I can also select timeline name. And it's pretty good standard practice to give your timelines names that are appropriate to either the project name or the deliverable standard, and also include version numbers. So if you have a good naming convention, then it makes sense to use the timeline name a lot of the time. So I'll have that selected, and I'll also make sure that the location makes sense. So I'm going to click Browse, and on my desktop, I'm going to create a new folder. I'll call this Exports. Click Open to select it, and now this is where this file will be generated. Step 2 will be to review the duration of my render, and as I mentioned at the beginning, by default it's set to entire timeline, which I'm very happy with. So then I can jump to step 3, which is to add it to the render queue. And my first job has now appeared. To remind myself of what this job was intended for, I can click at the very top of the job in the header and rename it from Job 1 to, let's say, HD High Definition YouTube. And then click Off. So I can either start to render this right away, or I can continue to create new jobs with different render settings and add them onto this list. Another common use for the render page is to generate rushes or dailies for editors. So dailies are just compressed versions of your original camera takes. With dailies, you will usually assume that there's a master timeline, the audio has all been synced to the video takes, and there's also maybe a preliminary grade or perhaps LUTs, lookup tables, applied to the clips in order for the editor to see what the final colors are more or less going to look like. I should note that DaVinci Resolve has its own internal proxy generator. So if you're going to be editing in DaVinci Resolve, there's not really a reason to generate these types of external dailies. But in case you're collaborating with someone, or perhaps you have producers or a director who wants to watch these takes at home, then it makes sense to generate these lighter files. For this, I am going to use a custom preset. So I already have custom selected. I'm going to return to the Video tab on the left-hand side here. And I will indicate that I want all the video clips rendered not as a single video clip, but as a set of individual clips. So when I click individual, that means that every single take on the timeline is going to be exported as its own video. I'm going to keep the format as QuickTime. That's perfectly appropriate for transcoded media or proxies. But I will change the codec from H.264, which is a temporal compression. It tends to be quite heavy to play back in editing programs. And instead, I'll set it to an intermediary format, like, for example, Apple ProRes, and maybe lower my quality from 422HQ to something like 422LT. Something else that I might want to do when generating dailies is apply a data burn-in to the video. So this is various information that is burned into the video or rendered, in the actual pixel data that people can use as reference and also as a form of protection for the original video takes. So to access your data burn-in controls, you need to go to the very top of the program into the Workspace menu and choose Data Burn-in. You'll end up with this floating window interface. On the left-hand side, you have a series of parameters that you can enable to place onto the video. And on the right-hand side is your controls for those parameters, so you can change their appearance. I'm going to pick up this window by the header so I can see my viewer. And a lot of these parameters are quite common to include in the burn-ins, but this all kind of depends on who they're going to. So what I send to a director for review might be different from what I would send to a client who's reviewing a final video. In terms of dailies, I probably want to include the source timecode, which is going to show me the timecode of the original video clips. And that means that if we're assembling something like an online cut, we know exactly which clips we have to refer to and at what point in time. And then, of course, for that, we will also need the source clip name. So when I select that parameter, the next label appears in the viewer, and now I can see exactly what names of all the clips were. Something else I might want to do is to include a semi-transparent overlay to protect this footage, from being shared. So we have a set of custom text parameters, as well as a set of logo parameters. So if you did have a production logo, you can superimpose it as a watermark, and include that in your renders. I'm going to use custom text and simply notify people not to distribute this material. However, right now it's kind of shrunk at the bottom of the video, so it could potentially be cropped out. What I would like to do is make it a little bit bolder, a little bit more dominating in this frame. So I will go into the options of the data burn-in panel, and I will ungang the render text styles. And what that means is that the text styles for these parameters will no longer be identical. Instead, I can modify them as I wish on an individual basis. So I'm going to click that to disconnect them. And now I can resize my custom text, reposition it, and even change the font if I wanted to. We also have opacity controls for the background and for the text itself. So I'll probably want to make it semi-opacity. I'll type in 0.4. And now as I scrub through the clips, you can see that we have text disrupting, these clips from being shared. When I'm ready to hide this interface, I can click the X in the top left corner and continue with my render setup. One final thing I'd like to do is once again jump into the File tab to check exactly what my naming convention is going to be. It's a good idea when you're generating dailies or proxies that you use the original source names. That means that when you eventually replace them with your camera takes, that they will match up and instantly replace. You won't have to manually hunt them down. So I'll click Source Name. However, if you're aware that there are multiple cuts from the same source take being used in the timeline, then you might also want to indicate Use Unique File Names. That way the files won't overwrite each other as they're being generated. If there is a file with the same exact name, it will then adopt either a prefix, which is a number sequence at the start of the file name, or a suffix, which will append itself to the end of the file name. And now I'm ready to click Add to Render Queue at the very bottom of panel. And once again, I'm going to change the name of the job so I can keep track of what it was doing. In this case, I will label job 2 as dailies. I'll probably want to use this setting again in future, so I'm going to save it as its own preset. I'll navigate to the top right corner of the render settings palette, and I will choose Save as New Preset. This is in the ProRes standard, so it makes sense to call these my ProRes dailies. Then I'll click OK. And I'll see that my dailies preset now appears to the left of the custom preset, and I can access this again and again. Something else to keep in mind in terms of selecting your export range is that if I did want to focus on just a selection of clips, I could use my in and out shortcuts, press I to indicate a start point, select a clip and press O, and you can see the duration is marked in the timeline at the very bottom of the page. And if you'd like to reset your in and out range, you can either use the shortcut Option X on a Mac or Alt X on a PC, or you could go to the drop-down menu at the very top of the timeline and switch from in-out range to entire timeline to reset it. If you have multiple timelines in your project that you would like to add to the render queue, you don't have to jump back into the edit or the color page to switch between them. You can stay in Deliver and use the drop-down at the very top of the viewer to switch between timelines. So in this case, I'm going to select an alternative cut of my trailer, and you'll see that will appear, and the data burn-in has stayed in place. So if I wanted to remove that, I could go back into my video tab, enter my advanced settings at the very bottom of this list. Here I can see that there is a section for the data burn-in, which by default will be set to same as project, which means that if I can see it in the viewer, then it will be included in my render. But I could also choose to bypass it by clicking on this dropdown and choosing none. I prefer to keep it on same as project, and instead I'd rather just go to my workspace menu at the top, select data burn-in, and then click the reset arrow in the top right corner to get rid of all these overlays. I'm going to collapse my panel, and I would like to add the render for this timeline to our render queue as well. So once again, I'll select a YouTube preset. This one I will leave untouched. I will click on Add to Render Queue, and now we have our third job. I'll call this my teaser trailer. By the way, you don't have to only concentrate on the timelines in your current project. You can actually have render jobs from various projects all lined up in the same render queue that you can then set off at the same time. If I go into the options menu of the render queue panel, I will find that there is an option at the top to show all projects. When I select that, this list becomes populated with a few other render jobs I created from a couple of other projects I had open previously. So that means that, without having to constantly start and stop my renders and open and close projects, I could just send everything to the render queue. And then when I'm ready to kick this off, I can open up Show All Projects, scroll across the list, and then hold Shift and click to select all of my jobs, and then select Render All when I'm ready. And the benefit of doing it this way is that you're not waiting for every single render to complete in order to kick off the next one. That way you could lose hours of time because, it could be several minutes or hours between you returning to the project to kick off the next render. With batches, as soon as one timeline is completed, it will immediately move on to the next job. So then you can keep it running overnight, and then wake up the next morning and everything's already completed for you. By the way, if you add a job and you decide that you want to change some of the settings, that's pretty easy to do. In the top right corner of every job, you will find a few icons. The X should be self-explanatory. You can use this to get rid of a job that you no longer want. But then the pencil next to that is an edit tool. So let's say after we completed our HD YouTube job and we added it to the queue, we realized that we want to change the resolution. I'm going to click on the pencil icon, and this job is now loaded in the render settings. I know that because we now have these 3 new buttons at the very bottom of the render settings panel: cancel, update job, and add new job. So I can now go through my video, audio, and file tab to determine, I actually want the resolution to be a little bit lower. I want my collaborators to review this for me before I upload it. So I'll set it to 720p. HD ready, and maybe restrict my quality to 8,000 instead of 12. I can now click on Update Job at the bottom of my render settings, and the job is now updated in the render queue, so I don't have to recreate it or re-add it to the list. And once I'm all done, I can select all of these jobs and click Render All. A couple of tips I can give you for setting up your render projects in case you're not feeling too confident about your render settings is to look at the destination, where your project is going. And usually you will find information there about what is expected from you. So for example, if you're uploading it to a website, there tends to be a page of recommended settings for uploads. If you're sending your video to a festival or to a theater, you can usually communicate with the organizers or perhaps find a submission guidelines page, which will also tell you what they expect from you in terms of formats and data rates. And then finally, if you're sending your video to something like a broadcaster or a streaming service, these can differ quite dramatically from one region to the next. So again, it's the best idea to talk to them directly and find out exactly what they're expecting from you in terms of video and audio deliverables. And of course, you can also come to the Blackmagic Design forums to get answers from our developers, from digital image technicians, and professional users of our software. Please make sure you check out the remainder of the videos in this series to find out how to use DaVinci Resolve for your projects.